The following is a Laura Flanders Show audio exclusive.
Thank you, Keeanga. I'm really happy to be with you, honestly, and thank you for bearing with us. We're talking about housing as a human right, and how do we go from a culture of commodification to a culture of care and community and society? It's a long journey, and this conversation is just part of it. Housing, though, lives at the nexus of so many power relations and so many critical problems in our society, from healthcare to safety to environment to democracy, that many, many things are wrapped up in it. Can you describe for us, just for starters, the situation that we currently face nationally and there in Philadelphia? What are we seeing?
Well, I think that in the way that the pandemic has shown so much of what is wrong in the United States, the inequality in the United States, it's done the same thing in terms of shining a spotlight on the depths of housing insecurity in the US. And so, when you look at the rising rates of unemployment, the rising numbers of people being pushed into poverty, you can't understand those rising numbers without understanding that it has a corresponding impact on people's housing security, on people having a safe, sound, secure place to stay every day. And so that too has been thrown into peril. We are now looking at the possibility of millions of people being evicted from their homes when both federal and local moratoria expire within the coming weeks in January. And that, I think it's important for people to understand that that is not hyperbole, that there are millions of people in this country who have been forced to pause their rent payments because of a lack of income, or because of having to make decisions about whether they will eat, whether they will now, keep the lights on, or whether they will pay their rent. And so the US already had a housing crisis moving into this situation where you have people who were paying more than 35% of their income on rent, a portion, 18% of people paying more than 50% of their income on rent, for African Americans facing a historic low of home ownership between 40 and 47% over the last year, which has meant that the majority of Black people are renters in this country, and that the roiling of the renters market has placed them in particular peril. So that existing crisis has then been pushed to the edge by the crisis wrought by the pandemic. And we are seeing the full consequences of the lack of any meaningful organization or structure around securing people's right to housing in the United States.
Well, as you've written in Race for Profit, your Pulitzer Prize contender book, this didn't come from nowhere. I mean, Black homelessness, houselessness was engineered. You say Black home ownership was undermined. How?
Well, I mean, this is the long history of African American experience moving from a mostly rural population to an urban population. And so for the duration of the 20th century, Black people encountered many obstacles, some generated through the private market, many generated through public policy, in terms of trying to dictate where Black people could live. And much of this is being organized by the real estate industry. And so, over the course of the 20th century, as the US government begins to develop its housing policies beginning in the 1930s, they call upon the private real estate and banking industries to help formulate public policies, which is something that always happens in this country. When the federal government begins to take new policy initiatives, they call on the private sector for its, quote unquote expertise. Well, in the real estate industry, this expertise had everything to do with how to segregate African Americans for whom it had determined had a deleterious impact on property values, because African Americans were poor, Black people lived together, and because of residential segregation enforced not just through public policy, but also through acts of violence by white people, either through mob violence, in Chicago, bombing Black people's homes was a popular effort to keep Black people confined to particular areas of the city. And so this meant that African Americans were often living in overcrowded spaces because they had fewer neighborhoods and housing choices to pick from. And so all of this has an impact on Black communities, on properties that Black people live in, that is assumed to be attributed to behavior or to lifestyle choices, and not to racial discrimination in the dissemination of housing or in racially discriminatory public policy. But those practices, which begin very early in the 20th century, are then used to influence policymaking decisions about where Black people should live, and should Black people have access to the same kinds of programs that really created a middle-class white population in the US after World War II, where white GIs and ordinary white people in general were given access to government-backed home loans that allowed them to purchase houses in suburban areas that became, of course, the cornerstone to the American dream. Black people were excluded from this endeavor really until the 1960s, and the urban rebellions forced the federal government to relent and finally create home ownership programs that were directed at them.
We're going to talk more about that and pick up on that in just a minute, but I do want to go back to something that you said and talk about what's happening in Philadelphia.
Sure. Because
you've written that racism and racist practices are have been used as a kind of crowbar in America to destroy the welfare system for everybody, the social safety net, really society for everybody. And another aspect of what we're seeing on the housing front is the move to sell off public housing. Maybe it's been given a bad name through the racist kind of descriptions that you described and the policies and practices carried out by government. But at this point, it's then used as a reason to get rid of it, let it deteriorate and sell it off. That was what was in the works in Philadelphia, has been in the works for a long time. What happened?
So this is a really insidious practice that happens in cities across the country, where you have public housing authorities, organizations that are established by the federal government, whose purpose is to actually provide housing to low income and poor families. Well, now that they find themselves in the position of lording over public housing properties, so properties that are owned by housing authorities, and instead of rehabilitating these properties, instead of fixing them and housing people who need them, instead, a lot of these housing authorities are waiting to what we would describe as the peak of the market to then flip the houses to developers for profit. And so they claim that this is an effort to both move properties because they don't have money to actually rehabilitate them, while also keeping the coffers of these various housing authorities full. But it really points to the brokenness of our public policies regarding creating secure housing for people. And part of this is because public housing has become such a demonized program, really since the 1960s in this country, where since that period, the effort has been to destroy public housing, and certainly not to replace and to rebuild it, but to essentially get rid of it and leave communities dependent upon vouchers. And so in Philly, this was certainly the plans of the Public Housing Authority, they still intend to sell a portion of their portfolio, even as we have 5,000 homeless people in the city of Philadelphia. We certainly, with the eviction crisis looming, will see those numbers rise. But instead of finding security and housing for people, the Public Housing Authority is moving in the opposite direction.
There's a political aspect to all of this, in that the federal government, really since Reagan days, has been vilifying big cities, red, black, red, Democratic, red, just generally problematic. But at the same time, those housing authorities depend on federal dollars. And so as the dollars are shrunk and the capacity shrinks, the city takes the blame. In Philly, you saw activism this year, and you've seen it for many years, but this year it became a headline around the country. What was happening in terms of occupations, house squatting, women of color at the center, no surprise given what you've said. Who is showing up to those occupations, and what does it mean that in the middle of a pandemic and an epidemic of police violence, it was a safe space for a lot of poor people of color and moms?
So I think people really have to see the connection between the crisis wrought by the pandemic and the way that activists mobilized around housing in particular, because a lot of this began when unhoused people went to the Philadelphia International Airport to stay in the terminal. The terminals of the airport where baggage claim is located. So on the first floor of the airport, because people were not flying. And so this was a huge space that would allow people to socially distance, but it would actually, give people, provide a roof over people's heads. And people stayed, I think it was near more than 100 people stayed in the airport for all of April and most of May. And then the city inexplicably decided to evict them, even though the issues that had brought them to the airport, a lack of place to shelter in place, when that was a local edict, right? That we all had to find a place to stay out of the path of the pandemic and to not spread COVID-19. And so the city came in and gave lip service to finding a place for people to live, but the intent was to actually evict people. And so many of the people who then showed up at the parks in downtown Philadelphia, and then across from the Public Housing Authority's headquarters, had been housed. They had housed themselves at the Philadelphia International Airport. And so there was a direct connection between the lack of housing security, the pandemic, and finding a solution, really, when the uprising around the murder of George Floyd, I think, opened up the political possibilities for taking dramatic action. And that is what, these houseless people did, but also alongside activists who have been working on these issues of housing and security in the city for some time. There was also a smaller action taken by mothers, primarily led by mothers back in March. And these women took over empty public housing units in Philadelphia that, again, had been abandoned by the Public Housing Authority. These are, empty houses that people went into and took over for the same purposes of creating a shelter for themselves, so that they could shelter in place. And so part of the agreement with city officials, after a 126-day occupation in the public areas in downtown Philadelphia was that these women could maintain these properties until some other kind of proper housing replacement to their choosing had been determined. And so this, this I think is a tangible example of where government on both a local and federal level have failed, that people have been forced to take the initiative themselves to figure out this problem.
Now, Philadelphia is unique. Philadelphia is unique in many aspects, and hovering over this story, I'm reminded of the history of this city, which is, I think, the only one where the city government approved the bombing of housing, going back to the 1980s with the attack on the Move compound, which was a set of houses run by people of color with a Black activist orientation. The length and the specificity of the organizing in Philadelphia has given some people pause as they consider whether the model here is replicable. But you've said, no, what's happening here is strategically, it's strategically something that could be generalized across the country. In what aspects? What are the parts that you think are most important to lift up and perhaps to consider for other people where they live?
Well, I think probably the main thing is that this kind of housing owned by public housing authorities that they are just sitting on exists in many cities across the country. I mean, we have a general problem in this country where you have a growing population of unhoused people and you have empty houses. With the Moms for Housing struggle in Oakland, California, the house that those women took over was owned by a private developer. But you see both the private developer and the public housing authority using the same kind of logic, which is we want to wait until the market reaches its peak to flip these empty properties for profit. And so I think that that model of taking over and occupying that space can exist everywhere in this country. I think what is important to say about how to go about doing that has to do with the level of organizations that have been involved in local housing struggles over a period of time, who know literally the physical terrain of the city and where the housing is located and available, but also most importantly, how do you utilize your networks to call upon people to do eviction defense when the city inevitably tries to move in and take those properties? And that was part of the genius of the Philadelphia action. It was on 3 separate occasions. For some strange reason, the city of Philadelphia would announce publicly that they were going to make an effort to evict the encampments. And that just became an organizing call for activists across the city to show up, to put pressure on the city, but to really defend the encampments from being evicted. And so I think that kind of potential exists everywhere. And we see the development of housing organizations. There's a kind of informal network of eviction defense, tenant rights organizations forming across the country so that people are in touch with each other. But I think as long as we are in what I would describe as an acute housing crisis, where you have mass unemployment, where you have millions of people being pushed into poverty, millions of people experiencing the anxiety of housing insecurity, millions of people facing eviction, and at the same time, millions of empty properties where either public officials or developers are just waiting to turn a profit on these properties, that all of the ingredients for both a confrontation and occupation of these properties in the name of actually being able to provide people decent places to live is on the table.
It's not just in the housing area. it's across the board. We have profit as a motivator above all. And really, in very simple terms, the housing crisis is caused by the fact that profit is such a powerful motivator for capitalists, developers, private landlords, and the rest. How the heck do we tackle that? Is that a culture shift? And do you see it happening?
It is. It requires an enormous cultural shift, but I think even before that, I think it requires really trying to grasp the depth of the problem. There has been a consistent shortage of safe, sound, and affordable housing in the United States over the entirety of the 20th century and now into the 21st century. And this is by design. If we think about the way that our government has left the production and development of housing almost exclusively to the private sector. And so why is there no affordable housing? Because it's not profitable. It's that simple. And you can see it in terms of the building priorities in cities across this country. In Philly, the main housing that is being built are $1 million condos. That's the housing that is being built because that is where the profit is. Creating housing that, people, this is the largest, poorest, I forget how they formulate. It's like of the biggest top 10 biggest cities in the United States, Philadelphia is the poorest. But the housing that is being built is, for people who are extremely rich, for millionaires. And so that is the conundrum. And it means that in this city, there are hundreds of apartments that have been legally designated unfit for human habitation. That's what the city said. That's how the city defines them. They are unfit for human habitation and they are filled with people. And that is what happens when you have a failure to build and develop housing that is safe and sound and decent for people. Then it necessarily means that people will then pay rent for anything, because housing is like food, it's like water, it's like medicine. You cannot decide that you will go without, and so people, those conditions mean that people will pay enormous sums of money for inferior housing, because that is how they because that is what we're forced to do. That's the.
I remember the woman in Miami in 2009, I think it was, or maybe 2008, right after the mortgage meltdown, and there was a mortgage broker there, and he was saying, "Well, she signed the agreement," and she's saying, "Of course I signed the agreement. It was 13-year wait on the affordable housing line, and I had a kid in a place where rats were crawling over my baby, so of course I signed." Right. That was then. The problem remains. We have coming into our administration, into Washington now, a man with a long record in all the issues that you've raised. Last time there was this much economic hardship was that 2008 period. He was part of the response to that. That response didn't help us avoid this moment. He was also part of the response to the largest racial uprising against racism in this country that preceded this one, going back to the 90s and the LA riots, in which time he passed the 1994 crime bill. It increased incarceration. Long question, but what do you take from that experience for this moment in terms of where we should put our expectations as a people, where we should put our effort and energy in terms of work?
I think it's twofold. On the one hand, I think that you can have stewards of the political system of our society who recognize that the methods undertaken by Trump don't work. You can't just have the virus run unchecked. You can't just have millions of people threatened with eviction come January. And so do I think that the Biden administration will take a more proactive response and do something in relationship to Trump? Yes. Do I think it will be enough? No. And therein lies the problem. I think that the crises in the United States are huge. They're multiple, and they're growing with every single day. And what it really requires is the kind of response that is completely contradictory to anything that our government is prepared to do, no matter who would be in charge, whether Democrat or Republican. We are talking about a massive, massive infusion of money, of programming that needs to be implemented. And so Joe Biden is a history as a deficit hawk who's concerned about spending too much money, who's concerned about issues related to so-called big government. And that is exactly the wrong concerns to have right now. So I expect to be underwhelmed by the incoming Biden administration, even though I think they will do more than the criminally negligent Trump administration. But I think that it then puts the onus back on the grassroots movements, the social movements, to not only lift certain demands around what is necessary for housing, but it creates a certain amount of pressure to engage in the type of tactics that have been undertaken here in Philadelphia, in Oakland, in Los Angeles, and in different places around the country, because it dramatizes the desperate need that exists and the insufficiency of government action. And so that will be the ongoing tension during this period, I think.
So in terms of demands, you can regulate the developers, you can protect the existing public housing, you can construct new housing. The point that you made earlier, though, is we're really talking about a shift, maybe an attitude towards public, or what's called in many parts of the world, social housing. In Vienna, apparently, city of, lights in Europe, place that is routinely declared the most attractive place to live. I think about 50% of people live in public housing, in social housing, that has a very good reputation and appeals to everyone and has no negative connotations. We've never had that here. And from the reporting I've done, it's part of the American dream for African Americans too, to have their private home. So increasing market value of homes works to increase family wealth in the Black community too. How do we handle that? How do we address that in our movement demands?
By recognizing that it hasn't worked that way. I mean, that is how it's advertised, right? That's how the American dream and home ownership is advertised. And it hasn't, for the majority of Black people, it hasn't worked in that way. The Brookings Institute did a study in 2018 that found that on average, Black homes are valued $48,000 less than what white homes are. And also, there's a much smaller proportion of African Americans who are homeowners. And so to have our entire social contract and arrangement tied up in individual families' ability to personally accumulate wealth, buy their own homes, that is then supposed to function as the fund that pays for their kid to go to college, as the fund that sustains them if there is an unforeseen financial or healthcare crisis, as the fund that is supposed to secure their retirement, is a lot to put on individual families for whom many people, the house for Black people is not an accruing asset over time, but is a debt burden that is under constant threat of foreclosure. And so we have to reconceive of what the social contract should be, and that it shouldn't be based on your ability to finance itself, or to get the golden goose asset that actually does accrue over time. That we should have a social contract, social safety net that protects everyone. no matter if they're able to buy their own home or not. And we have the resources to do that. And I think that is part of a different kind of conversation for which I think the space has been opened for that. When we are talking about universal health care in this country and no longer laughed out of the room in doing so, when we are able to talk about the potential of ending student loan debt, federal student loan debt, and no longer laughed out of the room doing so, then we can certainly talk about the reinvigoration of other aspects of the public infrastructure, including public housing, and not these kind of, mishmashed, mixed income developments, but decommodified housing that is not built for, intended for the market, but that is intended to house people. That is all possible. When we spend nearly $1 trillion a year on the military, no one wants to hear anymore after the CARES Act, that there's no money. We know that there's money.
So you mean we wouldn't have to be married, able-bodied, active producer of widgets to have healthcare and a place to live and something to eat?
Exactly.
Shocking.
Exactly. We can do it.
Can we do it? You have kids. Do you think we will see the kind of change you're talking about in your kids' lifetime? What do you think will be the story the future tells of this moment?
I think we have to. I think that we are running at the end of this cycle of putting in elected officials from both parties who, do a little dance and say what you want to hear during election year, and then proceed to do absolutely nothing that they promised to. I think that the crises that we face are too huge to continue down this road. I mean, it's not just in employment, housing, the criminal justice system. The earth is not an infinite resource that we can continue to abuse in this way. And so if we're ever going to get serious about taking on the challenges of this climate crisis, it necessarily means that we have to rethink everything about the way our society is organized. And so that won't come just from an enlightened elected official. That will come from pressure from below, and not just the pressure that comes with protests in movements and demonstrations, but also the formation of ideas and politics and desires. And that's what this whole discussion connected to healthcare for all, the whole discussion connected to ending student loan debt. This is all about the formulation of new ideas, of new politics, of new demands. And that really is where the hope for me, and I think people who are engaged in that endeavor lies.
Me too. And I think the viewers and listeners to this program too. So it sounds, and we're at the close, but it sounds as if what you've seen there in Philadelphia has moved you, has changed you, maybe inspired you. Would that be right?
No, absolutely. I think that I was, just as surprised as many people in this city at the duration of the protest here around George Floyd. I was shocked maybe a week into the protest where almost 100,000 people marched in downtown Philadelphia. And so the ability for activists to so quickly pivot and use the opportunity opened by that moment to make a connection between housing insecurity and Black Lives Matter, because the vast majority of unhoused people in Philadelphia are African American, and saying this is how we will make Black Lives Matter. The city has been not following through for months, for years, on its promises to create housing alternatives for people, to create some level of housing security for people. And instead of just being cynical about that, these people took action. And in doing so, I think not only did they inspire people here locally, but I know for a fact that they have inspired activists who work on these issues from around the country to take similar action.
Thank you. That was perfect. Thank you so much. Appreciate
you.
it.